Ooh, you got your scarves? Did you find your earmuffs? Maybe a hat? Yeah, I found a scarf. I know it's a Gryffindor scarf, and you know I'm a Ravenclaw, but that's alright. It'll do. The Cold War continues. I hope that you're staying warm, as the Cold War is going to actually really heat up today. Here we go. Remember, the Cold War was a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers that were left over after World War II. It lasted for about 45 years. Let's go and talk about Germany. Remember, Germany was the losing side or losing country in World War II. Germany had been blamed for this war, and Germany was being punished. At the end of the war, the four allied countries, United States, Great Britain, France, and Soviet Union, they each got one region of Germany to rebuild and govern for themselves. You can see it in the map right above me. Elections were supposed to reunite the country, but the Soviet Union refused to hold elections. Remember, the Soviet Union was a communist country. They set up East Germany with a communist government. We also saw the capital city of Berlin, which was in East Germany, also divided up into four regions, where those four allied countries each took one part of the capital city to also govern. You can imagine this is going to create some conflict, some competition here. The capital city was divided with Eastern Berlin, or East Berlin, as communist by the Soviets, and West Berlin as being a democratic society where people could vote for their elected officials and have a voice in their government and have rights and that kind of thing. So we see the city and the country of Berlin and Germany being divided up. Okay, let's switch gears for a second. In 1948, the United States created what's called the Marshall Plan. And it's a U.S. aid program that is going to promote economic recovery. Basically, the United States is going to give money to these countries. And you might go, why would the United States bother giving away their money? They're a superpower. Why don't they use it for themselves? Build things up, make life good for Americans. The thing is, when you help other countries, then they become less desperate. So for instance, if these countries became so desperate, they might decide that they're going to do something drastic that could then harm the United States. And so what's good for them could also be good for the US. So the United States government gives this money to countries that would be helpful for economic recovery. And on the map there, you can see how tall those stacks of dollars are right above here. The more dollars that are stacked up, the more money the United States gave to those countries. All right. Well, in 1948 and 1949, the Soviet Union decided they wanted control of all of Berlin. And they wanted to make sure that the Allies, especially the United States, wouldn't come in and help those people in Western Berlin. So the Soviet Union created a blockade, which blocked all supplies getting into West Berlin. Remember that West Berlin, right here, is democratic, but it is here surrounded by communist East Germany. So by blockading supplies, Joseph Stalin was hoping that those people in West Berlin would become so desperate that they would turn to him for help, that they would allow communism to spread into the western part of Berlin. And the United States, remember, had this policy of containment. They wanted to keep communism where it was and not let it expand. Well, if it expanded into Western Berlin, then that means communism expands. So the United States decides we have to help the people of West Berlin so that they don't starve to death or turn to the communist government for help. So during the Berlin Blockade, the United States leads the Berlin Airlift. And basically, U.S. planes flew over West Berlin, dropping supplies down to the people of West Berlin to help them. Nearly 300,000 flights went over West Berlin dropping supplies over the year or so, and almost 8,000 tons of supplies were dropped every day. The U.S. realized it needed to have its allies ready for another war in case the Soviet Union continued doing these kinds of things. Here's a couple other images of the Berlin Airlift. You can see the planes just lined up, loading up, and they would just take off, consistently flying out of West Germany and flying over West Berlin and dropping off those supplies. And you can see the people of West Berlin are happy for this, and they're cheering as the Berlin Airlift airplanes fly over. All right, so we keep moving on. 1949, a new alliance is formed called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And on this map right above me, all of those green countries there, those are all the NATO countries. They're democratic countries. They agreed to protect each other. It's an alliance. And they have democratic societies, meaning people can vote and have rights, and they get to say who they want to vote for and that kind of thing. Okay. Over here, though, the reddish countries, that's the Soviet Union and what's called the Eastern Bloc, a bloc of countries, a collection. And they call that the Warsaw Pact. That's their alliance. It's created in 1955. These are communist countries who, again, agreed to protect each other if attacked. You might remember back to World War I, we talked about these alliances being one of the causes of World War I. Well, now we've got alliances starting again. You can imagine that people are getting a little uneasy about this, wondering, are we going to have a World War III? I hope not. Okay, so this is now how Europe looks 1949 and into the 1950s. Okay, now we jump ahead to 1961. In 1961, the communist government of the Soviet Union built a physical barrier, a wall, called the Berlin Wall. And this Berlin Wall divides East Berlin and West Berlin with a physical barrier. And the idea is that the people of East Berlin might want to escape communism into democracy. And so this wall keeps them from leaving East Berlin. It wasn't just a physical wall. It was also barbed wire, dogs, guards, landmines, guns, other barriers. There's lots of ways that they kept people in East Berlin. I'm going to post this video as well. It's called Berlin Walled In. It's about 9 minutes long. It's really excellent if you want to understand more about how the Berlin Wall was built and what kind of barriers were in place there. Let's talk about the Cold War at home now, in the United States. Okay, what was life like here in the United States during this time? Well, it was a time of icy tension, right? But it was also a time of fear for Americans. Americans were terrified that the communists might attack. They had these nuclear weapons as well, just like the United States did, and it was possible they would use them. And so Americans were really afraid of this attack, but also they were afraid of communists being inside of the United States, infiltrating the U.S. It was known as the Red Scare. And Americans nicknamed communists the Reds. So anytime you see something like that, talking about red or the Reds, it's talking about communism. And you can see some of this propaganda here. You see, the Red Menace is real. Report all suspected communist activity. It turns everybody kind of into either spies or police, watching for spies. Right above me it says, "Is this tomorrow? America under communism." And you can see just things inflamed and terrible. And then there's a movie over here called The Red Menace, the most serious threat to our nation today. And you can see along the bottom there some of the things that they fear of communism. So it was a real fear, but it was also a fear that was stoked, or fuel was poured onto the fire to get communist fear to spread. And one of the people that was a main culprit of spreading this fear was this senator named Joseph McCarthy. And Senator Joe McCarthy is actually from Wisconsin, just over to our east, our neighbors to our east. Senator McCarthy had only been a senator for his first term. He was a new senator, but he was really afraid of communism and communists infiltrating the U.S. government, the U.S. military, and everyday life in the United States. So he led the search for spies. And lots of people were arrested. Thousands of them were arrested and investigated. But no spies were found. People were afraid to speak up against him because he was a really fierce, direct speaker. And he was really intimidating. He accused actors and actresses of being communists, people from all walks of life. But his misstep was when he said that there was communists in the U.S. military. The U.S. military was like, there are not communists here. You are wrong. So this was known as McCarthyism. There were some spies found, not really by this Joseph McCarthy, but Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were a married couple, and they had been suspected of and arrested for and accused of stealing atomic secrets during the Manhattan Project. That was when the United States was building those atomic bombs. And they were convicted of selling the atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, and they were given the death penalty. And they actually were put to death. So just to show you, there was a real threat. Okay. One more thing that the United States was facing here. Americans were preparing for nuclear war. They were fearful that the Soviets might drop nuclear bombs on the United States, and Americans needed to be ready, so they began to build bomb shelters. Right above me is called a fallout shelter. And these fallout shelters were built, or they were just places inside of schools, hospitals, universities, places that were underground, that had brick walls, that people from the community, or the city, or the town, could go and hide in case there was a nuclear attack. That's called a fallout shelter. Over here, right over here, is called a do-it-yourself shelter. Americans started building bomb shelters in their backyards underground. They would dig it up, build the walls, and stock it up with all of the things they might need if there was a nuclear war. You might think of them today as like a doomsday prepper, right? So do-it-yourself shelters. And then right above me, you see some kids hiding under their desks. This was because there was some propaganda or some idea of if there's a bombing, that students need to be safe as well. So it's known as duck and cover yourself under the desk. I'll show you that piece of propaganda and advertising a little bit later. Okay, so that's what life was like at home during the Cold War. The icy tensions continue as the Cold War turns hot. We're going to talk about tomorrow the arms race that's building up weapons, the space race, getting to outer space and the moon, two wars, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Those are known as proxy wars. That's when the United States and the Soviet Union didn't engage in war with each other directly, but they helped others fight against each other. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is the moment that the United States was this close to nuclear war, and the world was at risk in this nuclear war as well. All right, so the Cuban Missile Crisis, they came eye to eye, as they say. They came eye to eye, and the other guy blinked. So you'll find out more about those things. All right, so we've now heard about Germany, the Berlin Blockade, the Berlin Airlift, the Berlin Wall, and we talked about what life was like in America during the Cold War with Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism, what life was like for the Rosenbergs, the Red Scare, and preparation for nuclear war. Now it's time for me to duck and cover. Whoa!